Welcome to another deep dive into a world where numbers can be hilarious, terrifying, and everything in between, you know?
I love that description.
Today we're exploring the fascinating world of mathematical mishaps with Matt Parker's book, Humble Pie, a comedy of math errors, as our guide.
Oh, a great choice.
Now, Matt Parker isn't your average mathematician. He's a former math teacher turned stand-up comedian who, get this, lives in a house filled with retro video game consoles.
That's dedication.
So, you know, he's got a unique perspective on things.
For sure.
We're going to uncover how seemingly simple math errors can have massive real-world consequences. We're talking billion-dollar financial losses, near fatal engineering disasters, and even a nuke Happy Gandhi.
That's right. What Parker does so well is use humor to expose those moments where math goes off the rails, reminding us that even in our highly technical world, things can go wrong in unexpected and sometimes comical ways.
Okay, let's rewind to 1995.
Okay.
Remember that Pepsi commercial offering a Harrier jet for 7 million Pepsi points?
Yes, the classic case of a marketing gimmick gone awry.
It seemed ridiculous, right? John Leonard saw an opportunity.
He did.
And sued Pepsi.
Yeah.
He noticed Pepsi let you buy extra points for 10 cents each, meaning the jet would only cost $700,000 a steal compared to the actual $20 million price tag.
It's all about perspective, right?
Right, so what happened?
Well, Pepsi obviously argued that the ad was a joke, and no reasonable person would believe they were actually giving away a military aircraft for soda points.
I mean, I can see their point. It is a bit out there.
Right. But Leonard argued that Pepsi had created a legally binding offer, and he had fulfilled the terms of that offer by amassing the required points.
So it ended up in court.
It did, and the judge ultimately sided with Pepsi, but not without acknowledging the humor of the situation.
Oh, really? So what did the judge say?
In his ruling, the judge actually said, the notion of a teenager accumulating 7 million Pepsi points to receive a Harrier jet is outlandish. And he went on to describe the ad as funny, emphasizing that no one could reasonably conclude that Pepsi intended to deliver a Harrier jet.
Well, I guess that settles this.
What's interesting here is how this case exposes our vulnerability to something called anchoring bias.
Anchoring bias.
Yes, we latch on to that initial number, the 7 million points, and it skews our perception of the actual cost.
Oh, so, we fixate on that huge number and it makes everything else seem smaller in comparison.
Precisely, and marketers exploit this all the time. They present us with an inflated price or a limited time offer to make the actual price seem more appealing.
I never thought about it like that.
It's all about framing and perception.
So it's not just about the math, it's about how our brains are wired to process information.
Exactly, and when dealing with large numbers, our intuition often fails us. We struggle to grasp the real difference between a million and a billion, for example.
That makes sense. I mean, I know a billion is way bigger than a million, but it's hard to really wrap your head around the scale of it.
It is, and that's why these kinds of mathematical mishaps can happen. We underestimate the power of those extra digits.
It's a good reminder to always double-check those calculations, especially when there are millions or billions of dollars at stake.
Or Harrier jets.
Speaking of things that are surprisingly complex, have you ever stopped to think about how calendars work? I mean, we use them every day, but the math behind them is more intricate than you might realize.
You're absolutely right. Calendars are a great example of humans wrestling with the complexities of time and attempting to impose order on a chaotic system throughout history. There have been some significant calendar calamities. Take ancient Rome, for example.
Ah, yes, the years of confusion. Before Julius Caesar came along with his calendar in 46 BCE, they were adding extra months seemingly at random.
Exactly. Caesar's Julian calendar, with its 365 days and a leap year every 4 years, was a huge step forward. But even that wasn't perfect. It turns out the Julian year was slightly longer than the Earth's actual orbit around the sun by about 11 minutes.
So even with Caesar's best efforts, the calendar was still drifting out of sync with the seasons. Talk about a long-term problem.
And that's where the Gregorian calendar comes in 1582. Pope Gregory III decided to tackle this problem to realign the calendar. 11 days simply vanished from September 1752 in countries that adopted it right away.
Can you imagine waking up and realizing you'd lost 11 days of your life? People must have been freaking out.
While there's no historical evidence of riots, you can imagine the confusion. But this isn't just ancient history. We've got another time-bending computer glitch on the horizon.
Oh no, not another Y2K.
Well, its older sibling, the 64-bit Unix time issue, is set to hit us in 2038.
This sounds like it could be a much bigger problem than Y2K.
Yeah.
What are we looking at here? What are the potential ramifications?
Many computer systems track time using a counter that starts from January 1st, 1970. Some use a 32-bit counter, which caused the Y2K bug. Others, a 64-bit counter. But even that 64-bit counter will eventually hit its maximum value and reset to 0.
So in 2038, computers could think it's 1970? Again, that sounds like a recipe for chaos.
Indeed, financial systems infrastructure, anything relying on accurate timekeeping could be affected. Thankfully, we've got some time to prepare and hopefully learn from Y2K. These time-related glitches remind us that even systems designed for precision can be vulnerable to unforeseen complications.
It's a good reminder that even small oversights can snowball into major problems, especially when dealing with systems as fundamental as time. Now let's shift gears and explore how math errors can play out in the physical world, specifically in engineering.
From wobbly bridges to twisting skyscrapers, engineering miscalculations can be dramatic and in some cases disastrous. A fascinating example is London's Millennium Bridge, often nicknamed the Wobbly Bridge.
Oh yeah, I remember seeing footage of that. It's a beautiful bridge. But on its opening day in 2000, it started swaying unexpectedly, not exactly the grand debut they were hoping for. What caused that? Was it a fundamental design flaw?
It wasn't a design flaw in the traditional sense. The issue stemmed from something called synchronous lateral excitation. Essentially, the natural rhythm of pedestrians walking across the bridge created vibrations that amplified the bridge's natural sway.
So it wasn't that the bridge was poorly constructed, it was more an unanticipated interaction between human behavior and the bridge's physics. It's amazing how something as simple as walking can have such a powerful effect on a massive structure.
Precisely, the engineers hadn't fully anticipated how the bridge would respond to the rhythmic movement of large crowds. Luckily, they were able to fix the wobble by adding dampers to absorb the vibrations.
It's a good thing they found a solution now. It's a perfectly stable, albeit slightly less wobbly landmark. But it makes you wonder what other seemingly minor factors could have such a huge impact on these large-scale engineering projects.
That's a great question, and it leads us to another infamous bridge that fell victim to an unexpected interaction of forces. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge.
Oh, you mean the bridge that famously danced itself to destruction? That footage is hard to forget.
Yes, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsed in 1940 due to aerodynamic flutter. Essentially, the wind created oscillations that the bridge couldn't withstand. It's a stark reminder that even with precise calculations, engineers need to account for complex and sometimes unpredictable forces.
It's like nature always finds a way to throw a curveball, even at our most carefully engineered structures. It's incredible and a bit terrifying how much power these natural forces have.
And these forces aren't limited to bridges. Remember the John Hancock Tower in Boston, the skyscraper that was twisting?
That's right, the one where they had to install those giant lead weights on the top floor to stabilize it like a giant architectural pendulum. What caused that?
The John Hancock Tower suffered from torsional instability, meaning it was prone to twisting. Especially in windy conditions, the lead weights submerged in oil act like shock absorbers to counteract the twisting.
It's fascinating how engineers can come up with these ingenious solutions to fix unforeseen problems. It's like architectural improvisation, but those fixes come after the fact. What about preventing these issues in the first place? Are there any lessons learned from these structural mishaps?
Absolutely. The Hyatt Regency walkway collapse in Kansas City in 1981 is a chilling example of how seemingly minor design changes can have devastating consequences.
There's a tragic incident. What happened exactly?
Yeah. The walkway had 2 levels, both suspended from the same rods during construction. They changed how the rods were connected, which unknowingly doubled the load on some of the bolts, and tragically, no one rechecked the calculations after that design change.
So during a busy event, the overloaded walkway collapsed. It's a heart-wrenching reminder that even small oversights can have devastating consequences, especially when human lives are at stake.
It highlights the crucial need for rigorous checks and balances throughout the engineering process. It's not just about building bigger and taller, it's about understanding the underlying math and ensuring that every detail is carefully considered.
Okay, so we've seen how math errors can impact physical structures. But what about the digital world? Data seems pretty straightforward, right? Just ones and zeros?
You would think so, but even in the digital realm, seemingly simple data can be surprisingly troublesome. Before we can even think about analyzing big data, we need to ensure little data, those individual data points, are collected and stored accurately.
It's like making sure the ingredients are right before baking a cake. Bad ingredients, bad cake. bad data, well, who knows what you end up with.
Exactly. And one of the most common data headaches comes from, believe it or not, names. Imagine being named Steve Null, for example. It sounds made up, but these names can wreak havoc on databases.
Wait, how can a name be a problem for a database? It's just a word.
In databases, NUL is a specific term indicating missing or unknown data. So when you try to enter Steve Null into a database that uses NUL as a special command, it can cause all sorts of errors. It's like speaking two different languages to the computer.
Poor Steve. So what happens in these cases? Do people have to legally change their names to avoid database confusion?
Well, some databases have ways to work around this by using specific formats for names, but it's a surprisingly common issue, and it's not just null. There's Brian, Test, Avery Blank, Jeff Sample.
Yeah.
These are all names that can get mixed up with database commands or testing protocols.
Wow, so our digital systems are tripped up by common names. What about the less common ones? Can those cause trouble too?
Absolutely. Hackers can exploit online forms that ask for your name with something called a SQL injection attack. They insert malicious code disguised as a name, hoping it will slip through the cracks and give them access to the database.
So they're basically using a secret code to break into a system. It's like a digital Trojan horse.
Yeah. I'm guessing databases have gotten better at security over the years.
The stakes are too high to ignore these vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
But even with improved security, simple data entry mistakes can still lead to some bizarre outcomes. Take, for instance, Null Island.
Null Island, that sounds made up.
It is, or at least it started that way. When computers can't figure out the location data for something, they often assign it a default location for a while. The default location for Los Angeles was the LAPD headquarters, meaning all crimes with unknown locations were mapped to the police station.
No wonder crime stats in LA were so high. So how did a fictional island get involved in all this? The LAPD, realizing this was a problem, redirected all those unmapped crimes to a fictional location, 0 degrees latitude, 0 degrees longitude, a spot in the Atlantic Ocean, and then some cartographers with a sense of humor decided to add Null Island to certain maps.
Wait, so a data quirk accidentally created a cartographic legend that's incredible. It's like a digital glitch in the fabric of reality. But these data glitches, they don't really affect anything too important, right?
You'd be surprised. Remember those gene names, RCH5 and SAP15, that Excel kept turning into dates?
Those core genes never stood a chance against Excel's auto-formatting.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It corrupted scientific research scientists studying these genes, had their data messed up, potentially affecting the validity of their findings, all because of a simple spreadsheet error.
Whoa, so a simple spreadsheet error could have a ripple effect on scientific understanding that's both incredible and slightly terrifying. So we really can't take data for granted. It's not as simple as it seems.
Absolutely. Data is only as good as the systems we use to collect, store, and analyze it. And as we've seen, those systems, no matter how sophisticated, are still vulnerable to the quirks of human error.
And those errors can have some pretty wild consequences, from fake islands to skewed scientific research. It makes you wonder what other hidden data disasters are lurking out there. But before we delve into that, we need to talk about another area where our intuition often fails us: probability and statistics.
Oh yes, probability and statistics, even seemingly simple questions in this domain, can lead to a surprising amount of confusion and debate.
Okay, I'll admit stats isn't my strong suit, but I'm ready to have my mind blown. Where do we even begin?
Let's start with a seemingly simple question that sparked a huge online debate. How many days are there in a week? Seems easy.
7, unless we're talking about some alternate reality where time works differently.
That's what most people would say, but the way the question was phrased led to a surprising amount of confusion. It all boils down to something called a fence post error.
Fence post error, now you've got me really intrigued.
Imagine building a fence. If you have 10 fence posts and want to build 10 sections of fence, you'll need 9 fence panels. There's one fewer panel than posts. It's the same concept with days of the week. If you start counting on Monday the first day, then Sunday the 7th day is only 6 days later.
Ah, I see. It's all about where you start counting. Like 2 wrongs don't make a right, but 3 lefts. Do you end up somewhere different depending on your starting point?
Exactly. This seemingly trivial error can pop up in various situations, leading to miscalculations and confusion. Remember that mathematician who missed the deadline to return his son's phone by a day?
Oh, you mean James Propp and his saga with Verizon Wireless?
That's the one. The phone had a 14-day return policy, but Verizon counted the day of purchase as day 1, making the deadline the 13th day, not the 14th. Propp insisted he was within the return window, and he was right. It was a classic off-by-1 error that unfortunately cost him his refund.
What a frustrating situation. But these off-by-1 errors, are they really that common? Could they have more serious consequences than a denied phone return?
They certainly can, and one case that illustrates this is the wrongful conviction of a British woman based on flawed probability calculations.
Oh, yes, I remember reading about this. This was the case where the prosecution used flawed statistics to argue that the chances of two siblings dying from SIs were astronomically low, implying the mother must have murdered them.
Exactly. Their argument was based on the assumption that the deaths were completely independent events, which might not have been true. The probability of SIs in one child could very well influence the probability of it happening to a sibling.
It's scary to think that flawed statistical reasoning like that can lead to such a grave injustice.
It's a chilling reminder that probability, when misused, can have devastating real-world consequences.
So what you're saying is, even though probability seems like it should be objective, the way we frame the problem and interpret the data can massively influence the outcome.
Precisely. It's a cautionary tale about the power and peril of statistics, but misinterpreting probability isn't limited to legal contexts. It can fuel irrational behavior, like the Italian lottery obsession with the number 53.
The number 53, what happened there?
For over a year, the number 53 didn't appear in the Venice lottery. People became convinced it was due and started spending exorbitant amounts of money betting on it.
So they were basically gamblers falling prey to the gambler's fallacy, thinking past events could somehow influence random future events.
Exactly. They assumed that because 53 hadn't appeared for a while, it was more likely to show up soon. But each lottery draw is independent, meaning the past results have absolutely no bearing on the future.
It's like flipping a coin. Just because you get 5 heads in a row doesn't mean the next flip is more likely to be tails. But in this case, it sounds like the consequences were far more serious than a lost coin toss.
Unfortunately, yes. People were borrowing money, selling their belongings, all because they were convinced that 53 was going to make them rich. And tragically, some people even took their own lives because of the financial despair this obsession caused.
Wow, that's both fascinating and incredibly sad. Shows how powerful our belief in patterns can be, even when those patterns are just illusions. We're wired to seek order in chaos, and sometimes that leads us astray.
It highlights our inherent need to find meaning, even in randomness. And that brings us to another seemingly insignificant area of math that can have surprisingly significant consequences: rounding errors.
Rounding errors, those seem pretty harmless. It's just a matter of a few decimal places, right?
You'd think so, but rounding errors, especially when compounded over time or when dealing with large numbers, can have a significant impact. Remember Jim Hines, the record-breaking sprinter we talked about earlier?
The one whose 100-meter sprint time initially appeared slower because of the timing equipment.
Yes, the timer rounded his time up to the nearest hundredth of a second, making it seem like he was slower than the previous record holder, even though he was actually faster. It was a minor error, quickly corrected, but it highlights how even tiny rounding discrepancies can have a ripple effect.
It's amazing how those tiny fractions of a second can make such a big difference, especially in the world of competitive sports. Are there other examples where these rounding errors had more significant consequences?
Absolutely. Take, for instance, the report claiming solar power would save 51,999 lives each year.
That oddly specific number definitely seemed a bit suspicious.
The original figure was based on an estimated number of deaths from coal power, which was rounded to 52,000 when they calculated the lives saved by switching to solar. They got this overly precise number based on a rounded figure.
So it's like building a house of cards on a shaky foundation. The precision is an illusion.
Exactly. The precision was misleading, a product of mathematical sleight of hand. And then there's the persistent rumor about Mount Everest's height being rounded up for credibility.
Wait, you're telling me the tallest mountain in the world might not be as tall as we think it is?
Well, according to the rumor, the original survey calculated the height as 29,000 feet exactly, but they were worried people wouldn't believe such a round number, so they added 2 feet to make it seem more accurate.
So, Mount Everest gets a height boost just for looking too perfect. It's like a cosmic joke. But seriously, rounding errors can have real-world consequences beyond a slightly inflated mountain, right?
Absolutely. One of the most striking examples is the Mizuho Securities trading debacle in 2005, where they lost billions of dollars because of a typo in a stock trade.
That's right. The one where they accidentally entered an order to sell 610,000 shares for 1 yen each, when they meant to sell 1 share for 610,000 yen. It's mind-boggling how 1 decimal point error can cost billions.
It was a simple typo, but the way the trading system worked, the order couldn't be canceled. It was a hard lesson learned about double-checking your work, especially when dealing with large sums of money. But sometimes rounding errors are intentionally exploited, as in the salami slicing technique used in financial scams.
Salami slicing. That sounds delicious and slightly nefarious.
It is. The idea is to steal tiny amounts of money from many accounts, hoping no one will notice such small discrepancies. For example, a program could round down interest calculations on bank accounts and transfer the fractions of pennies to a separate account.
So it's like skimming a little bit off the top over and over again, death by 1,000 cuts,
Yeah,
but for your bank account.
precisely. And because the amounts are so small, they often go undetected. It's a clever but unethical way to exploit the limitations of our financial systems.
Okay, so we've seen how rounding errors can be accidental, intentional, and sometimes even hilarious. But what of the bigger picture?
Yeah.
How do we make sense of all this data and avoid these pitfalls?
That's where data visualization and a healthy dose of skepticism come in. We need to move beyond just looking at numbers and start thinking critically about what those numbers represent.
So it's not just about crunching numbers, it's about understanding the story they tell.
Exactly. And one of the most common mistakes is relying solely on averages, which can be incredibly misleading. Remember the U.S. Air Force's cockpit design fiasco?
The one where they designed cockpits based on the average pilot, but failed to account for the actual diversity of body types.
That's right. They assumed if they designed for the average pilot, everyone would fit, but it turns out there's no such thing as an average pilot.
Of course, human bodies come in all shapes and sizes. It's like trying to fit everyone into a one-size-fits-all outfit. It's just not going to work.
Exactly. They ended up with cockpits that didn't fit most pilots, highlighting the danger of relying solely on averages. And to illustrate how misleading averages can be, consider the data source dozen.
The Datasaurus dozen, are we talking about a group of data-obsessed dinosaurs?
Not quite. It's a collection of 13 data sets that all have the same statistical properties, the same average, the same standard deviation, but when you visualize them, they look completely different.
So on paper, they look identical,
Yeah.
but visually, they tell completely different stories.
Precisely, one data set looks like a dinosaur, another like a circle, another like a starburst. It's a
Yeah.
powerful reminder that data visualization is crucial for understanding the nuances and patterns hidden within data.
It's like they say a picture is worth 1,000 spreadsheets. It shows the importance of looking beyond the raw data and seeking out different perspectives. And speaking of different perspectives, let's talk about confirmation bias and how it can distort our interpretation of data. Remember the claim about megalithic sites in the UK being linked in a pattern of isosceles triangles, the idea that ancient Brits were using triangles as some kind of prehistoric sat-nav.
That's the one that sounds fascinating, right? Except it turned out to be a classic case of confirmation bias.
Meaning they were looking for patterns that fit their pre-existing beliefs, kind of like seeing faces in clouds.
Exactly. They focused on the data that supported their triangle theory and ignored the data that didn't fit. It's a common trap we all fall into, especially when dealing with complex information.
So it's like cherry-picking the evidence to fit your narrative that's not exactly scientific. But how do we avoid falling into these traps? Are there any telltale signs that we might be letting our biases get in the way?
That's a great question, and it brings us to a crucial concept in data analysis: understanding the difference between correlation and causation. Have you ever heard of the correlation between the number of people who died by tripping over their own feet and the number of math PhDs awarded in the US?
Wait, seriously, that's a thing.
It is a classic example of a spurious correlation, a connection between two things that appears statistically significant but is actually just a coincidence.
So just because two things happen at the same time or follow a similar pattern doesn't mean they're actually related.
Exactly. Correlation does not equal causation. It's one of the most important lessons to remember. When interpreting data, we need to look for causal links, not just coincidental patterns.
That's a great point. It's so easy to get caught up in those seemingly meaningful patterns and forget that correlation doesn't necessarily imply a cause and effect relationship.
And that's why critical thinking is so important in the world of data. We need to be aware of our biases, seek out different perspectives, and constantly question our assumptions.
It sounds like navigating the world of data requires a detective's mindset. You've got to be on the lookout for clues, false leads, and red herrings. But let's be honest, sometimes the most intriguing mysteries are the ones that seem utterly random, like how do computers even generate randomness in the first place? It's a machine. Shouldn't everything be predictable?
That's an excellent question. True randomness is surprisingly difficult to achieve, even for computers. In the early days of computing, they used things like rolling dice or measuring atmospheric noise to generate random numbers.
Wait, so they literally built a dice rolling machine to power their computers? That's amazing. I can't even imagine how that would work.
It sounds outlandish, but it's true. The UK government actually used a machine called ERNIE electronic random number indicator equipment to generate winning numbers for their premium bonds program.
So Ernie was basically a giant government-sanctioned slot machine, but how did they make sure the numbers were truly random?
The early versions of ERNIE used glowing neon tubes. The random fluctuations in the neon's behavior were converted into numbers, creating a surprisingly effective source of randomness.
Wow, that's brilliant. It's like harnessing chaos to create order, or at least the illusion of order. It's a shame we can't all have a giant neon tube random number generator at home.
Yeah.
But how do modern computers generate randomness without relying on these elaborate physical contraptions?
As technology advanced, computers began using algorithms to generate what we call pseudo-random numbers. These numbers appear random, but they're actually based on a starting value called a seed.
So it's like planting a mathematical seed that grows into a sequence of seemingly random numbers, but if you know the seed, you can predict the sequence, right?
That's right. And that's why choosing a good seed is crucial for generating high-quality pseudo-random numbers. Modern computers use complex methods to create seeds that are as random as possible, often based on things like the computer's internal clock mouse movements or even atmospheric noise.
It's like they're trying to capture a little bit of real-world randomness to feed into their digital simulations. But what happens if the seed is predictable? Can that lead to any problems?
Absolutely. A predictable seed can lead to some embarrassing and sometimes disastrous outcomes. Remember the infamous Press Your Luck scandal in the 1980s?
Oh yeah, the game show, where a contestant figured out the pattern of the random lights and won a ton of money. Didn't they have to change the game after that?
He did. The show used a pseudo-random number generator to determine which squares on the big board would light up. But the algorithm wasn't truly random, and Michael Larson, the contestant, figured out the pattern.
It's like he hacked the game show, he memorized the sequences and knew exactly when to press the button to win. It must have been incredibly frustrating for the producers to realize their system wasn't as random as they thought.
It was a huge embarrassment for the show, and they had to redesign their system to incorporate true randomness. It's a great reminder that even in something as seemingly lighthearted as a game show, the pursuit of randomness can be a serious business.
Speaking of serious business and things that could go very wrong, didn't you mention something earlier about a nuke-happy Gandhi?
Ah, yes. The legend of Gandhi's nuclear rampage in the game Civilization. It's a classic example of how a simple programming error can have unintended and hilarious consequences.
Okay, you have to tell me more about this. Did Gandhi suddenly decide nonviolence wasn't working out for him? What happened?
Not quite. The game designers gave Gandhi a very low aggression rating, reflecting his pacifist nature. But later in the game, as civilizations became more advanced, all leaders had their aggression ratings lowered.
And because Gandhi's rating was already so low, it looped around to the maximum value.
Exactly. It was a classic integer overflow error, where a number wraps around to the opposite end of the scale when it exceeds its maximum value. And that's how Gandhi, the apostle of peace, became a nuclear warmonger in the digital world.
It's like a digital twist on the fest saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Except in this case, it was a good programmer who accidentally made Gandhi do something very, very bad. That's hilarious. But it does make you wonder what other seemingly minor programming errors could have much more serious and less humorous consequences.
That's a great point, and it leads us to one of the most infamous software errors in history, the Ariane 5 rocket explosion in 1996.
Oh, right. That was a major setback for the European Space Agency. What exactly happened there?
In short, the rocket's onboard computer tried to stuff a 64-bit number into a 16-bit space. It's like trying to squeeze an elephant into a phone booth.
So another case of an integer overflow error. But didn't you say the root cause was a bit more complex than that?
Yes, while it was technically an integer overflow, the root cause was a bit more nuanced. The rocket's software was designed to handle a certain range of values based on the previous Ariane 4 rocket. But the Ariane 5 had a different trajectory and reached higher speeds, causing the software to encounter values it wasn't prepared for.
So it was like the software was using an old map to navigate new terrain. It wasn't equipped to handle the new data it was encountering.
Precisely that mismatch led to a cascade of errors culminating in the rocket's self-destruction just 40 seconds after launch.
It's a stark reminder that software, like any complex system, needs to be carefully tested and validated, especially when the stakes are so high.
Absolutely. As we become more reliant on software to control everything from our cars to our power grids, the consequences of even minor errors can be enormous. It's a humbling reminder that our technological progress is still bound by the limitations of human understanding, and sometimes even the best laid plans can go awry.
So what's the takeaway from all these mathematical mishaps? It seems like we're constantly battling against our own limitations and the unexpected quirks of our systems. It's fascinating and a bit unsettling all at the same time.
That's a great point. It's true that we're constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and with that comes the potential for error. But I think the key takeaway is the importance of awareness, humility, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
So it's not just about learning the formulas and algorithms, it's about understanding the context, questioning the assumptions, and always double-checking our work. It's like that old saying, measure twice, cut once, but for math.
Exactly. And if you can't explain a mathematical concept simply, you probably don't understand it well enough. So the next time you encounter a number, a statistic, or a calculation, don't just take it at face value. Ask questions, dig deeper, and remember, even the most brilliant minds can make mistakes. It's fascinating how, even in a world increasingly dominated by data and algorithms, the human element, with all its quirks and inconsistencies, still plays such a crucial role.
It's a good reminder that we can't just blindly trust the numbers or the systems that generate them. We need to approach data with a critical eye, understanding both its power and its limitations. But speaking of limitations, how do computers even handle the concept of randomness? I mean, aren't they designed to be predictable?
That's a great question. True randomness is surprisingly difficult to achieve even for computers. You see, in the early days of computing, they used physical methods to generate random numbers.
Wait, seriously, what kind of methods are we talking about? Did they have like tiny robots flipping coins inside the computers?
Not quite robots, but they did use things like rolling dice and measuring atmospheric noise. In fact, the UK government used a machine called ERNIE, short for Electronic Random Number Indicator Equipment, to generate winning numbers for their premium bonds program.
So ERNIE was basically a giant government-sanctioned slot machine. That's incredible. How did they ensure those numbers were truly random?
The early versions of ERNIE used glowing neon tubes. The random fluctuations in the neon's behavior were converted into numbers, creating a surprisingly effective source of randomness.
That's amazing. It's like they were harnessing chaos to create order.
Yeah.
But how do modern computers generate randomness without relying on these physical methods?
As technology advanced, computers began using algorithms to generate what we call pseudo-random numbers. These numbers appear random, but they're actually based on a starting value called a seed.
So it's like planting a mathematical seed that grows into a sequence of seemingly random numbers.
Yeah.
But if you know the seed, you can predict the sequence, right?
That's exactly right. Choosing a good seed is crucial for generating high-quality pseudo-random numbers. Today's computers use complex methods to create seeds that are as random as possible, often based on things like the computer's internal clock or even atmospheric noise.
It's like they're trying to capture a little bit of real-world randomness to feed into their digital simulations. What happens if the seed is predictable, though? Can that cause problems?
Absolutely. A predictable seed can lead to some embarrassing and sometimes disastrous outcomes. Remember the infamous Press Your Luck scandal in the 1980s?
Oh, you mean the game show where a contestant figured out the pattern of the random lights and won a ton of money? That's a classic example of how a seemingly random system can be exploited if there's an underlying pattern.
That's right. The show used a pseudo-random number generator to determine which squares on the big board would light up, but the algorithm wasn't truly random. One contestant, Michael Larson, figured out the pattern.
He was like a code breaker. He memorized the sequences and knew exactly when to press the button to win.
Exactly. He exploited the predictability of the pseudo-random generator and walked away with over $110,000. It was a huge embarrassment for the show, and they had to redesign their system to make it truly random.
It's a reminder that even in something as seemingly lighthearted as a game show, the pursuit of randomness can be serious business.
But speaking of serious business and things that could go very wrong, you mentioned Anukapi Gandhi earlier.
Ah, yes, the legend of Gandhi's nuclear rampage in the game Civilization is a classic example of how a simple programming error can have unintended and often hilarious consequences.
Okay, you have to tell me more about this. Did Gandhi suddenly decide nonviolence wasn't working out for him? What caused this sudden change of heart?
Not quite. The game designers gave Gandhi a very low aggression rating reflecting his pacifist nature. But later in the game, as civilizations became more advanced, all leaders had their aggression ratings lowered.
I see where this is going. And because Gandhi's rating was already so low when it was lowered further, it looped around to the maximum value. Exactly. It was a classic integer overflow error where a number wraps around to the opposite end of the scale when it exceeds its maximum value. And that's how Gandhi, the apostle of peace, became a nuclear warmonger in the digital world.
It's almost poetic in a way. The man who preached peace transformed into a digital agent of chaos, all thanks to a simple programming oversight.
Yeah.
It's hilarious, but it does make you wonder, what other seemingly minor programming errors could have much more serious and less humorous consequences in the real world?
That's a great point, and it leads us to one of the most infamous software errors in history. The Ariane 5 rocket explosion in 1996.
Oh, right. That was a major setback for the European Space Agency. What exactly went wrong there?
In short, the rocket's onboard computer tried to stuff a 64-bit number into a 16-bit space. It's like trying to squeeze an elephant into a phone booth.
So, another case of an integer overflow error. It seems like these errors can crop up in the most unexpected places. But didn't you say the root cause was a bit more complex than that?
Yes, while it was technically an integer overflow, the underlying cause was more nuanced. The rocket's software was designed to handle a certain range of values based on the previous Ariane 4 rocket. But the Ariane 5 had a different trajectory and reached higher speeds, causing the software to encounter values it wasn't prepared for.
So it's like the software was using an old map to navigate new terrain. It wasn't equipped to handle the new data it was encountering, which ultimately led to its downfall. It's amazing how a seemingly small difference in trajectory could have such a catastrophic effect.
It highlights how even the most sophisticated systems can be vulnerable to unexpected inputs and how crucial it is to anticipate potential issues during the design and testing phases.
It's a humbling reminder that our technological progress is still bound by the limitations of human understanding, and that even the best laid plans can go awry. Speaking of things going awry, we talked a lot about errors in the digital and physical realms, but what about errors in our own thinking? How do our cognitive biases influence the way we perceive and interpret data?
That's a great question. Our brains are wired to find patterns and make connections, even when those connections don't actually exist. This tendency can lead us astray when analyzing data, especially when we're dealing with complex or unfamiliar information.
So it's like our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, but sometimes they create false narratives based on incomplete or misleading information.
Exactly. Our brains are excellent at filling in the gaps, but those gaps can be filled with assumptions and biases that distort our understanding of reality. One common cognitive bias is confirmation bias, where we tend to seek out information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs while ignoring evidence that contradicts them.
Oh, I've definitely been guilty of that. It's like when you have a favorite theory and you only pay attention to the evidence that supports it, even if there's a mountain of evidence suggesting you might be wrong. But how does this bias play out in the context of data analysis? Can you give me a real-world example?
Absolutely. Remember that study claiming there's a link between people who eat organic food and increased rates of autism?
Oh yeah, I remember that study causing quite a stir, but didn't it turn out to be flawed?
It did. The researchers cherry-picked data that supported their hypothesis while ignoring data that contradicted it. They focused on a specific time period where organic food sales and autism diagnoses both happened to be increasing, but failed to account for other factors that could explain the trend.
So it was a classic case of correlation being mistaken for causation. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one causes the other. It's like saying ice cream sales cause shark attacks because both tend to increase during the summer.
Exactly. That's a great example of how our intuition can lead us astray. We see a pattern and our brains automatically assume a causal relationship even when there's no evidence to support it.
It's a reminder that we need to be skeptical of easy answers and simple explanations, especially when dealing with complex issues. We need to dig deeper, ask critical questions, and be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
That's a crucial point. Critical thinking is the antidote to these cognitive biases. It's about questioning everything, evaluating the evidence carefully, and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
It's incredible to think about the interplay between order and chaos. Both in the natural world and in our human-made systems, it seems like we're constantly striving for predictability and control. Yet there's always an element of randomness lurking beneath the surface.
That's a great observation. It's like a dance between our desire for order and the inherent unpredictability of the universe. And this dance is particularly fascinating when we look at the world of data.
We talked a lot about the challenges of generating true randomness in computers, but I'm curious about something. Is anything truly random, or is there always some underlying pattern or order that we just haven't discovered yet?
That's a question that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries. Is randomness a fundamental property of the universe, or just a reflection of our limited understanding of the complex forces at play?
It's mind-boggling to think about. On the one hand, we see patterns everywhere, from the spiral of galaxies to the branching patterns of trees, but then we have things like quantum mechanics. where events seem to happen in a truly unpredictable way.
It's a fascinating paradox, and ultimately the answer might depend on how you define randomness. If we define it as the absence of any discernible pattern or predictability, then it's possible that true randomness exists at the quantum level.
But even if there is some element of true randomness at that fundamental level, that doesn't mean we can't try to understand and predict the world around us. We can still use the tools of math and science to model complex systems, identify patterns, and make informed decisions.
Absolutely, and even if we accept that true randomness exists, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding remains incredibly valuable. It's what drives scientific progress, technological innovation, and our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe.
It's a reminder that even when faced with uncertainty, there's always more to learn and explore. And that's what makes this journey so exciting. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the perils of Pepsi points to the wobbly bridges of London. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive into mathematical mishaps?
I think the most important takeaway is that math is everywhere, and even seemingly small errors can have a ripple effect with significant consequences. We need to be aware of the potential for error in everything we do, from designing bridges to interpreting data.
It's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, but for math.
Exactly, and it's not just about being cautious, it's also about embracing curiosity, questioning assumptions, and constantly seeking deeper understanding. The more we learn about math and its quirks, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of the world around us.
It's been a real eye-opener exploring these mathematical mishaps and data dilemmas with you. I feel like I've gained a new appreciation for the power and peril of numbers, the importance of critical thinking, and the ever-present potential for both human error and human ingenuity.
It's been a pleasure diving into these fascinating topics with you. Hopefully, our listeners have come away with a renewed appreciation for the complexities of data and the importance of approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism and curiosity.
To our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this journey into the world of mathematical mishaps and data dilemmas. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep those calculators double-checked. And remember, math is more than just formulas and equations. It's a lens through which we can view and understand the world around us with all this beauty, complexity, and occasional chaos.
Loved this video? Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. And don't forget to order the book, link below.